Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of the Talking Type 1 podcast with me, Daniel Newman. I just wanted to say thank you so much for choosing to listen to the podcast today. I really do appreciate it. So before I get going, I just wanted to throw a disclaimer out there that I am not the perfect diabetic and I don't think that person exists. But I do have some experience of living with type 1 diabetes. So I've been living with type 1 for over 23 years now. I was diagnosed in August 1996, and throughout that time I've definitely experienced many highs of diabetes and many lows of diabetes. But it's got me to a point today where I'm able to talk about both the good and the bad side of living with type 1 diabetes. And I'll go into talking about my diagnosis story a bit later in this podcast. But when it comes to living with a chronic condition, particularly type 1 diabetes, it is difficult. You do have that added extra burden of trying to manage your condition as well as living your normal daily life, going about your daily business. There are extra decisions that need to be made, whether you're the person living with type 1 diabetes or if you're a parent of a child who's living with type 1 diabetes, or even a partner of somebody who has type 1 diabetes. And actually with type 1, it's a physical, mental and emotional condition all wrapped into one. So whilst there is a lot of emphasis on the physical treatment of how you manage your type 1 diabetes, it does impact your mental and emotional health as well. And what I've learned in the years of living with type 1, and particularly what I felt, is that at times I've felt alone. And actually, the reason for this podcast is so that people living with type 1 don't feel alone. And there are people out there just like you and me who are facing this daily challenge of living with the condition and making all of these decisions like we are. And so on this podcast, you'll hear from different members of the diabetes community who are living with the condition or lives are affected by a condition, sharing their stories and their insights that will empower both you and me. And I'll also be sharing my own personal experiences of living with type 1 diabetes. So as I mentioned earlier, just going back to my diagnosis story. So yes, I was diagnosed in August 1996. So that was during the summer holidays, and it was my final year before starting primary school in the UK education system. So during the summer holidays, it was really warm outside, which for England at the time, it was quite surprising. But anyway, it was really warm, and I was drinking a lot of Ribena at the time. I remember that vividly. Just was at my nan's during the summer holidays, and just going into her cupboard where she kept Ribena, and was constantly drinking Ribena, obviously diluted with water. And then the 16th of August, so I was diagnosed on the 17th of August, my aunt took myself and my cousins to the cinema, and I was really unwell at the time, and we eventually had to leave the cinema early again, and I still continued to be unwell when we got home. So fast forward to later on in the evening, I was back at home with my mum, and I was still unwell during the night. So she had to call the emergency GP to come to our house, and when they came round, they tested my blood sugar, and he said, you have to take him to the emergency room now. So 10-year-old me was in accident emergency for a number of hours, not really sure what's going on, but remembering lots of needles and lots of tests. And back then I really did not like needles at all, and not really sure what's going on. Fast forward again to later on that night, early hours in the morning, the doctor sat me down, and I remember exactly how this was, and they basically said, you've got diabetes. So I had no idea what diabetes meant, the impact that it would have on my life at that time. It was just that I was unwell. I was in hospital, I think, for around 2 weeks, and I remember having to do my first ever injection where they asked me to test on an orange first. And for those of you who are listening who have type 1 diabetes, you can really understand how testing doing an injection on an orange compared to doing it on yourself, two completely different things. But anyway, my first injection hurt, and I was like, okay, wow, this is what I'm going to have to do for the rest of my life. I will go into further detail about my diagnosis story in a later podcast, just to throw that in. My teenage years were particularly difficult in terms of trying to manage those years, as well as trying to just be a typical teenager, but then having this long-term condition that I had to manage. And type 1 diabetes is a full-time job. Whether you are living with type 1 or you're a carer of somebody who has type 1, the condition itself is a full-time job. And those years were a real struggle, and it was a battle within me where I just wanted to fit in. But I had this condition which was taking up my time, and I'm not wanting to stand out, but I am standing out. And eventually that period of time, those teenage years, led to what, looking back, was diabetes distress and also diabetes burnout. And that lasted for a number of years, and I would say I eventually came out the other side my early to mid-20s. And fast forward to today, I'm in a much better place when it comes to managing my type 1 diabetes. My understanding and knowledge has improved. I am, however, living with complications of type 1 diabetes. So I've got diabetic retinopathy, and in 2013, I was diagnosed with chronic kidney disease, and I was fortunate to have a kidney transplant in April 2018. And I'll be sharing those experiences with you in later podcasts as well. So really what you should expect from the Talking Type 1 podcast is interviews with members of the diabetes community, with a little sprinkling and mix of my own personal experiences of living with the condition. The conversations and the podcast will be open and honest, and actually really talk about the real nitty-gritty of living with the condition that is known as type 1 diabetes. What this whole journey of living with type 1 diabetes has shown me that you can come through whatever it does throw at you. I'm not saying the journey will be easy, because it has been difficult at times, but I've been able to come through the other side and look back and say, wow, look what you've achieved, look how far that you have come. And I hope that the podcast will be able to help you in your journey of living with the condition. So it would be great if you could listen to one of the episodes that I've posted, and it would be great to hear your feedback as well in terms of what you think of the podcast, what you think of the episodes. You can leave a review on whatever platform you're listening to, or you can contact me directly. So I am on Instagram and Twitter. My handle is at T1D_Dan, or you can email me at talkingtype1podcast@gmail.com. The 1 is a digit. So thank you so much for choosing to listen to the podcast today. I really hope you enjoy it, and it'd be great to hear from you.